Using the Matilda login page, we're going to look at the basics of an SQL injection type called a timing attack. Essentially, it takes advantage of either making the database do a lot of work or going to sleep for a period of time so that we measure not what comes back in the response, but how long the response takes. Those differences can tell us a lot, including what data is in a database. So this is going to be a bit of a contrived example because the login page Matilda is more than happy to give away an error message that will tell you what the query is. So a timing attack is not necessary, but we can still use the page to do experiments with timing attacks and see how they work. So the first thing is to figure out if there's an SQL injection vulnerability in the system. So we know that there is. If we put in a single quote and then try to log in, we're going to get an error basically telling us what the query is and everything else. So there's definitely SQL injection problems with the site, at least in security level 0. So next, how do we construct a timing attack? Well, one way is to ask the database to do a lot of work. There's certain benchmarking commands and databases that can be used to do this. Another way is to ask the database to go to sleep for a few seconds, similar to the sleep command in most other languages. So we can see from the query that came back in the error message that our single quote ended here in the username. So one of the ways we could do a timing would be to close off the single quote in username, then try to type in a union statement. But we're going to run out of room here because there's an HTML restriction. We could use Firebug or 100 other tools to try to get around this restriction, but instead of doing all that, we're going to use burp because it's a lot easier to see what's going on instead of using Firebug to change the field width and length. So we're going to log in, and then it's going to send the request over into Burp Suite. Now, in order to keep the query from breaking anything, you can right click inside of Burp and say URL encoded you type. So we're going to say select sleep 5 and then comment symbol and an extra space to comment out the password part of the query. And another thing we're going to do, because this is going to get tedious to keep having to go back to the Firefox, hit login again to try yet another attempt and so on, we're going to use a feature in Burp Suite called the repeater. All it does is it takes the request that's here and it sends it over into the repeater, where instead of forwarding it to the server, getting the response, forwarding that back to Firefox and looking at the results, we can just hit the go button and then view the response directly in this pane below. So we'll go ahead and hit go now, and the response that comes back is actually still going to be an error. So the problem is that we're using a union, and in a union the number of columns in the original table, which is users, and the number of columns in our table that we're selecting, which is really just this single column sleep command, have to line up, both data type and also number of columns. So we're going to try to just use some padding columns, some nulls. We'll try one null and see how that works. And a single null is still going to produce an error because we haven't lined up the columns correctly. There's more columns in the table that the database is selecting against than is in our union. And a lot of times the error message will even tell you that. So select statements have a different number of columns. So let's try 3 columns and 4 columns. Alright, notice the response is taking some time to come back. In fact, if we look carefully, we notice it takes 5 seconds, which is the number of seconds we told the database to go to sleep. So if we put in a 10, we can just verify this to make sure that it wasn't a coincidence or network problems. And this time we'll notice it takes 10 seconds. So we haven't actually used a direct query to get information from the database, but we've used the difference in time it took the response to come back from the database to confirm that there's an SQL injection and to get a working query.